All right, hi. So welcome to week 12 of Introduction to Logic, rather, Philosophy 1500.02. This week we're going to be talking about fallacies, and in particular informal fallacies. So let's sort of take a step back and think about where we've been in this class. Right, so we started talking about what makes an argument good. Right, and what we zeroed in on was validity. Right, so we looked at a bunch of different ways to determine whether arguments are valid or invalid. So one way an argument can be good is if it's valid. Right, perhaps more is needed, right, to make it good. That is, perhaps validity isn't a sufficient condition, right, for an argument's being good, but it's at least a necessary condition for at least some arguments. These are what we'll call the deductive arguments, right, the arguments that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But there are other sorts of arguments, right, and other ways that arguments could be good or bad, right? So what we're going to be talking about this week, right, is a way that arguments can be bad, and these are called fallacies, or specifically informal fallacies. So the distinction between formal and informal fallacies is important here, right? So a formal fallacy, as the name suggests, right, is a mistaken reasoning that has to do with, well, the form of the argument. Right, so basically what we've been studying this entire class is the forms of arguments, right, and how their formal features, right, those features about their forms make them valid or invalid. Right, think about the sort of arguments that we've looked at with truth tables and the Venn diagrams, right? We don't need to know what any of the variables, the sentence letters or predicate or subject letters mean, right? We merely need to know how they relate to one another. Right, so these arguments are valid or invalid in virtue of their form or their formal features. Arguments have informal features as well, right? These are features that have something to do with other than its form, right? So here the idea is that the informal features of arguments have to do with their content, that is, what they're about, right? And some arguments can be bad in the following way. There's something wrong with the content of the argument, right, and what it's setting out to prove. Right, so the informal fallacies that we're going to look at, these are mistakes in reasoning having to do rather with the content of the argument rather than its formal features. So that's what we're going to be talking about this week, right? And this is going to be, I don't know, a somewhat long lecture where we just look at a bunch of different things, right? A bunch of different informal fallacies, right? And you absolutely must read the book, right? There's a lot of information there that I just won't be able to summarize in this lecture or in any series of lectures, right? So read the book, look at the examples. There are a lot of practice problems for you to do this week if you feel so inclined. But I think it's somewhat interesting and enjoyable and, dare I say, easy material, right? So it's a good way to sort of round out the semester. All right. So again, formal fallacies, right? These may, quote, be identified by merely examining the form or structure of an argument, right? So we've talked about the forms of arguments, right? So all A or B, all C or B, therefore all A or C. Right, so here's a question, is this a good argument or not? Well, to figure this out, right, we'd figure out whether or not it's valid or invalid. So we can build, a Venn diagram to figure this out. And I think you can tell just by looking at it that it's going to be invalid, right? So, or you could build a countermodel, right? So is it the case, suppose all A's are B's and that all C's are B's, would it follow that all A's are C's? No, it might be that, all men are persons, all women are persons, so all men are women, right? That would not follow, right? So the premises would be true, the conclusion would be false, right? So what I've done there is build a counter model, right? And this isn't about the content of the argument, right? The argument, as we're given it, has really no content, right? Rather, it's about the form of the argument or the formal features of the argument, right? So this should all be sort of old hat. Right, so informal fallacies, right, again, these are about the content of the argument, right? They're mistakes in reasoning having to do with the content of the argument. So let's look at this example. The Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms. Atoms are invisible, therefore the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. Okay, so look, the premises are true, the conclusion's obviously false, right? So we know that the argument's invalid, right? But it's not like, what's wrong with this argument isn't the form of the argument, right? We can think of arguments with a similar form that are valid, or we can think of arguments with a similar form that don't seem to make this mistake, rather. So what's wrong with this argument? Well, it's something about the connection between, like, atoms and invisibility, and something's being made out of atoms, which are themselves invisible, right? It turns out that there's a name for this, right? It's a common enough informal fallacy that is a fallacy about the content that it gets a name, right? So this is this is a fallacy of composition, right? So what it tells us is that there's something and it's made out of some stuff, right? And those stuff have some feature. So therefore, the thing that's made out of the stuff has that same feature. And in general, that's a bad sort of argument, right? So consider this. The soccer team is made out of, I don't know, people over 6 feet tall. Therefore, the soccer team is over 6 feet tall. Well, no, that seems like a bad argument, right? It might be the case that all the players are over 6 feet tall, but the soccer team isn't the sort of thing that has a height, right? Or if it has a height, when you say it has a height, what you mean is something like all the players are over 6 feet tall, right? Or consider this one. What would be another example? I'm made out of cells. Cells have, I don't know. What is the powerhouse of the cell? Oh, geez. Some of you are probably screaming at me right now. It's the, for goodness sake. Gosh, what is it? I'm made out of cells. Cells have the powerhouse of the cell, whatever that thing is. Sorry, I cannot remember this. It's on the tip of my tongue. Therefore, I have the powerhouse of the cell. Well, look, I'm not a cell. I'm not the sort of thing that could have that, even though all of my cellular parts have that as a part. Right, so what's going wrong here, right, isn't something about the form of the argument, right? Rather, to see what's wrong with the argument, you have to know something about the world, right? You have to know that even though things are made out of something with some sort of feature, it doesn't follow always that that thing has that feature that those things have, right? So in this case, the Brooklyn Bridge is made out of atoms, and it turns out that atoms are invisible, but it doesn't follow, right, that the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. So what makes fallacies sort of interesting, as we'll see, is that they sometimes seem to be fairly compelling arguments, right? They have a hold over us, right? And this is why we're studying them, right? To see sort of what they are, right? So we can avoid them. But what's going on here, right, is that we're sort of being pulled in two directions. So on the one hand, right, the premises or whatever evidence is given for the conclusion, these seem to be psychologically relevant, right? We find them compelling reasons, right? But it turns out that they're logically irrelevant to the conclusion, right? So it turns out that the conclusion doesn't actually follow from the truth of the premises, right? Even though, right, psychologically relevant, it seems to, right? So that's why, in some ways, these are so compelling or maybe so dangerous, right? So we need to try to be on guard to avoid these. All right, so now we're going to talk about some very common particular informal fallacies. So this week, rather than making my own slides, I'm using the slides that are provided to me by the book company. And really the reason I'm doing this is because I like the diagrams. Some people find these helpful, some people don't. I'm just going to walk through the diagrams and sort of talk about some examples. Right, so the first sort of fallacy, informal fallacy we're going to talk about is the appeal to pity, right? So here's what our slide says. The arguer attempts to support a conclusion by evoking pity from the reader or listener, whether directed toward the arguer or towards some third party. So let's start off with an example. So we're getting to the time of the semester near the end, right, where surely none of you, right, because you're all good students, but perhaps people you know will go to their professors and say something like, I should get an A in this class, right, or a B or a C or B plus or whatever, because if I don't, right, I won't be able to get into med school or law school or whatever. Okay. So what's happening here, right, is that the person making the argument, the student, right, who hasn't gotten the grade that they want, right, they're trying to, like, make me or other professors feel bad, right, make them pity them, right, because they're in an unfortunate position, right, and wouldn't it be nice if they didn't have to be in that position? And what do you know? I'm in a position to make it so that they're not in their position, right, that they get a better grade. So what they're doing, right, the arguer is evoking pity in me or the other professor, right, while asserting that they should get some sort of special treatment, like an A, say, right, rather than an A minus. Okay, so let's sort of think about what's going on here. Here's something to think about. Suppose that you need the A rather than the A minus. And you tell me that the reason you need it is because you want to go to law school, and you won't be able to get into law school otherwise. Is that a good reason for me to give you an A? Well, I mean, there's a sense in which maybe, right? Perhaps it would be very nice of me to do that to you, right, or do that for you. But as an argument, it sort of seems to be, well, bad, right? It doesn't really give me reason to suggest that you've earned the A, right? Instead, it relies merely on evoking pity in me, right? Which is not in itself a reason to do anything, right? So those sorts of arguments, they're fallacies, right? It's an appeal to pity, right? So don't make those sorts of arguments to me or to any of your other professors. Can you think of other examples of appeals to pity? Well, so all my examples are going to come from being like an instructor, but perhaps one day, one of you will be an instructor of some sort, a professor or a teacher or whatever, or maybe even just a manager of some people. And people will come to you and they'll say things like, I'm sorry I couldn't get that thing done on time, right? You should give me an extension. My grandmother died, or something like this. So these aren't really cases, right, in which this gives me a reason, right, for me to give you an extension or for anyone to give you an extension, right? It would be a nice thing to do, right? But it's not as though my giving you an extension or someone's giving you an extension follows from the evidence, right, that's been adduced, right? Instead, it just works on evoking pity in your reader or listener. So our next example is appeal to the people. Sometimes you might have encountered these arguments with fancy Latin names. I don't care much for the fancy Latin names. My impression is that if you pull them out in like a conversation with people, people will just think you're a jerk, right? So I'm not going to teach you them, but they are in the book. So if you want to see the fancy Latin names that go with these, check the book, which of course you're supposed to do. You're supposed to read the book. Anyway, the next one we're going to talk about is appeal to the people. And there are two sort of distinctions here, but let's sort of think about what appeal to the people really is sort of generally, right? And then we'll talk about the two forms, the direct versus indirect form. So in an appeal to the people, the arguer uses the reader or listener's desire for love, esteem, admiration, value, and similar emotions to get the reader or listener to accept a conclusion. So what would be an example of this? Well, how about this one? Suppose someone comes to you and says, if you do this, right, people will like you, so you should do it. Here, or perhaps better example, suppose your friend comes to you on Friday night and says, look, if you go out, then people are going to think that you're cool, so you should go out tonight. So in this case, right, the arguer, the person giving the argument, plays on, say, your need or my need or whoever's need to be liked, right, and asserts a conclusion on the basis of that. So what's going on here, right, is that, again, the reason sort of given for the conclusion doesn't support the conclusion. Right, at best it makes it sort of prudential that you should do this, right, but there's no sort of like argumentative force here. Right, so putting it in terms that we talked about earlier, maybe this is psychologically compelling, right, but it's not logically compelling. Okay, so there's a distinction that the book draws and other people draw between direct and indirect appeals to the people. So the direct approach occurs when an arguer addressing a large group of people excites the emotion and enthusiasm of the crowd. So an example of this would be when some sort of demagogue, right, maybe talks about, I don't know, all of the examples that come to mind are perhaps too politically charged. Says something like, well, in any case, focus on sort of recent political stuff going on. Anyway, the indirect approach, I think, is more interesting in any case. Here, the arguer is basically talking to like one person, right, and saying that, look, there's this huge crowd and they will do something if you do or don't do something, right? So the crowd doesn't have to be huge. Suppose you have children and a spouse, and you tell your spouse, look, you should really let Johnny do whatever, right, because otherwise, the children are going to be angry with you. Right. So again, there's sort of a prudential or psychologically compelling reason to do whatever, right, but it doesn't follow sort of logically from the evidence given that you should. All right, so here are two sort of common arguments if you're ever on, I don't know, Facebook or Twitter or any sort of comment section online. So these are arguments against the person. They come in two forms, ad hominem abusive and ad hominem circumstantial. So in the first, right, there are two arguers, right, or two people in an argument. And by argument, I just mean sort of back and forth, right? It doesn't have to be shouting or whatever. But the second person responds to the first person's argument by verbally abusing the first person. So suppose Donald Trump gives some sort of argument for a political position, and I say, well, Donald Trump is, I don't know, dumb, right? So we shouldn't listen to what he says. Here, this is perhaps a fallacy, right? It depends on whether or not Donald Trump has a good argument and whether or not Donald Trump's supposed dumbness has anything to do with his giving a good argument. In the ad hominem circumstantial, right, the respondent attempts to discredit the opponent's argument by alluding to the opponent's circumstances, right, and this hopes to show that this opponent is predisposed to argue in the way he or she does and should therefore not be taken seriously. So suppose I say something like, Joe Camel, a lobbyist for Big Tobacco, says that smoking is less harmful than you might have thought. But of course, Joe Camel would say that, right, because he is a lobby for the tobacco companies, or a lobbyist for the tobacco companies. So what I've done here, right, is say, look, this person is predisposed to argue that way, right, and shouldn't be taken seriously. So here's a question. Is this a fallacy? It might not be, right? So it depends on the person's status, right? So if it really is the case that Joe Camel is predisposed to argue this way, and it's relevant to what they're arguing, right? Whether or not their status affects like what they're going to say here, right? Maybe they have a vested interest in saying what they said, right? Then this might not be a fallacy. Compare it to this. Amy argues, sort of the best examples are politically not available anymore. Actually, here's one that's available. Amy argues for abortion rights, but of course she would argue that way. She has herself had 4 abortions or something, right? So, whatever. Okay, so what's going on in this, right? I take it that the number of abortions that Amy has had is like completely irrelevant to whether or not her arguments for abortion rights are like compelling or good arguments or arguments that needed to be responded to. So this is an ad hominem circumstantial argument, right? It's a fallacy, right? But you get these sorts of arguments in political discourse all the time, right? Maybe not one that's so on the nose as the example I just gave you, but I'm hoping that it's out there enough that people can see that there's something sort of fishy here. Okay, so here's one that people have a Latin name for, tu quoque, U2 fallacy, right? 2 arguers again, right? And we try to make one person look bad because they're arguing in bad faith, right? So suppose I say, look, there's all this evidence that suggests you shouldn't smoke, right? So don't smoke. And I say this to you, and suppose you're smoking a cigarette at the time, and you say, well, look, your argument must be bad because I just saw you smoking the other day, right? So my status as a smoker, if I were a smoker, right, would be totally irrelevant to the things that I'm saying there, right? Perhaps there really is good evidence that you shouldn't smoke. Hint, there is really good evidence that you shouldn't smoke. So if you do smoke, please stop smoking. But in any case, right, my status as a smoker or not a smoker is completely irrelevant to the sort of evidence that I gave. So our next fallacy is what we'll just call an accident, right? So we'll say that there's some sort of general rule that's applied to a specific case it was not intended to cover. So maybe the general rule is something like it's wrong to steal, right? But suppose your family's starving, right? And you just take a loaf of bread, right? You might think, look, there's this general rule, don't steal. And then you apply it in this specific case, and it says, look, you've done something wrong. That seems kind of uncompelling. But take Introduction to Ethics if you're interested, right? You might think, well, look, what's going on in this case is that there's this general rule, but it only holds in sort of like normal circumstances, but the circumstances in which you're starving are not normal circumstances, right? So the rule's being misapplied. So here's another one, missing the point. This fallacy occurs when the premises of an argument support one particular conclusion, but then a different conclusion, often vaguely related to the correct conclusion, is drawn. So here's an example. So to take an example from recent political discourse, suppose it's the case that there really are people who vote illegally, right? If there are people who do this, the evidence suggests that it's like a vanishingly small number, right? You might say, look, people are voting illegally, so we should make it much more difficult to vote, right? So here I take it that the evidence that's given, that a few people here and there vote illegally, doesn't support the policy implementation that we make it much more difficult to vote for people. Or here's an example from the book that I think is, actually forget the example from the book. I don't actually like it. But yeah, good. So missing the point, right? We have some premises, right? They might be taken to support some sort of course of action, right? But someone just draws a completely different sort of conclusion from it. All right, so our next fallacy is the red herring fallacy. So what's going on here, right, is that someone says it's hard to explain and at a sufficient level of generality. So what's going on here is that someone's trying to convince someone of something, right, and might say, look, so-and-so has an argument, and then you say something to draw, as the diagram says, draw the listener off track. So suppose someone gives an argument that I don't like, right, for a conclusion I don't like, rather. And I say of this person, well, look, they've argued for this, but did you know that they do certain unsavory thing, right? So we should, like, beef up the police presence or something around their home, right? So sort of what's happened here is that I've said something, right? I've granted that the person I'm arguing against says something, and then I, like, throw in a bunch of other irrelevant information, right, that's designed to distract the listener from what it was that the other person said. All right. So next we have a group of fallacies that we can group together as fallacies of weak induction, right? So here we have premises that are relevant to the conclusion, right? They have something to do with the conclusion, but they don't quite support the conclusion, right? They're too, as it were, weak to support the conclusion. So here's a specific example of a fallacy of weak induction. It's the appeal to unqualified authority, right? So the cited authority or witness lacks credibility, right? So my father's not a doctor. Suppose, oh, good. Here's a good example. So anti-vaxxers, right? I assume everyone's familiar with the concept here. So anti-vaxxers often appeal to medical authorities. You can't see me, but I have scare quotes around authorities. Anyway, they appeal to these sorts of authorities that have been, like, constantly debunked, right? And then they say things like, vaccines cause autism. Okay. So what's happening here, right, is that the arguer is appealing to someone who lacks credibility, right? Perhaps they've had their medical license revoked, or the sort of article that they've published about vaccines and autism has been taken back, right? It's been said to be, like, obviously bad research, right? So the person who's being cited as an authority lacks the necessary credibility to make the case. So here's one of my favorites. This is the appeal to ignorance. So this happens when someone gives an argument, right, and the premises are sort of equivocal. They say something like, well, look, nobody has either proven or disproven the existence of, say, ghosts, right? And then the conclusion says something like, well, but there probably are ghosts, right? Or that there are ghosts, right? So here the premises support concluding, well, nothing, right? But then the conclusion is just, like, pulled out of thin air, right? Much like a ghost. So next, hasty generalizations. So this is a fallacy that affects inductive generalization. So what are inductive generalizations? So they're generalizations that proceed by looking at particular cases. So suppose I'm at the Super Bowl in the parking lot, and I ask, like, 10 people where they're going, and they say they're going to the Super Bowl, and I conclude, well, it's probably the case that most people in the parking lot are going to the Super Bowl. That's an inductive generalization, right? I look at some cases, and then I conclude that most cases in the area, right, most people in the area are also going to the Super Bowl, right? So that's the generalization. In that case, that seems good, right? That seems like a good generalization, right? Given what we know about, like, the Super Bowl football, or the Super Bowl parking lot, like, why else would anyone be there, right? So it seems like in this case, my sort of sample, the people I ask, they're going to be representative of the whole. But suppose I'm in the airport, LAX or something, right? And I ask 10 people, where are they going, right? And they say they're going to Aruba. it would be unreasonable for me to then conclude that it's probably the case that most people in the parking lot are going to, or the parking lot, the airport are going to Aruba. Why? Well, one, it's a huge airport. Second, not many people go to Aruba, right? So it's what's more likely, right, is that the sample I've chosen, right, the 10 people I choose at random or whatever, aren't representative, right? So in this case, it seems like a hasty generalization, right? It's a generalization from too few cases in too big of a potentially unrepresentative sample to conclude that most people in the airport are going to Aruba. All right, so our next fallacy of weak induction is false cause, right? So this occurs whenever the link between premises and conclusion depends on some imagined causal connection that probably doesn't exist, right? Suppose I think to myself, look, every time I have liquor before beer, I'm in the clear, right? And every time I have beer before liquor, I've never been sicker. So I should drink liquor before beer rather than beer before liquor, or however the rhyme is supposed to go. But suppose, right, what's going on here in both cases is that I drink pretty much the same amount, right? It's just in the first case, I come home and have a big meal, right? And in the second case, I just go straight to bed rather than like drinking any water or eating anything. Here, like the order of the alcohol, given that the alcohol amount is the same in either case, right, doesn't matter. All right, so the next fallacy we'll talk about, there are more in the book, check it out, is the slippery slope, rather. So this is a sort of fallacy that occurs when you say that, look, if one thing happens, then some sort of crazy, disastrous thing would happen as a result. Right, so we are luckily beyond this in our state of political discourse, but something very common that people would say in the early 2000s about gay marriage is something like, look, if you allow gay people to marry, then people will be marrying their dogs next, right? This is, of course, absolutely insane, right? And there's no sort of reason to believe that if the first thing happened, like the later thing would happen, right? So this is just a bad argument. So the next one we'll talk about is the false dichotomy, right? So this is committed when a disjunctive, right, or disjunction, either blank, 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 or blank premise presents two unlikely alternatives as if they were the only ones available, right? And the arguer then eliminates the undesirable alternative, leaving the desirable one as the conclusion, right? So suppose you reason as follows about this class. Either I will fail this class or I'll get an A. I won't fail the class, so I must get an A. So it might be the case that given the sort of student you are, both of these alternatives are unlikely, right? Perhaps you're a C student. But, you know, you're hardworking enough and industrious enough that you know you won't get an F, right? But it would be unreasonable of you to conclude in this case that you would get an A. Right, so the next fallacy we're going to talk about is actually the one we began with, right? The fallacy of composition, right? So this happens when you say that some attribute of the parts, right? So remember in the beginning it was like invisibility, right? Transfers from the parts to the whole, right? So the Brooklyn Bridge, though made of atoms, is not invisible. So we talked about that when we began. We can move on. Here's one that's very similar. So this is the fallacy of division, right? So it's the exact reverse of composition, right? So what happens here is we say, look, the whole has some property, right? And therefore the parts have that same property, right? So the Statue of Liberty is green, right? So therefore every part of the Statue of Liberty is green. Well, that's not that's not true, right? So the atoms, presumably, are not themselves green. Right, or what would be another example? The Statue of Liberty weighs more than 10 pounds, so every part of the Statue of Liberty weighs more than 10 pounds. No, not true, right? Sufficiently small parts weigh, say, 5 pounds or less.